All right, everybody, welcome back to SpearFactor Podcast. I am here, your host, Brett, with Devin from the Backcountry Hunters and Anglers, BHA, correct?
That's right.
All right. And we are here to talk about basically the issues that you might have seen me post a little bit more about lately and some of the things going on in California and probably will affect other places soon. But Devin, why don't you introduce yourself to give me a little bit of background and just who you are?
Yeah. No, thanks for having me on. So, name's Devon O'Dea. I'm the Western Policy and Conservation Manager for BHA. And I live in San Diego, but I grew up in Northern California. So got my start abalone diving, and then did that a lot as a teenager while you could still ab dive, and did a little, mountain fishing, fly fishing, things like that, backpacking. Didn't get into spearfishing and hunting until going to UC Santa Barbara, and then after school, got into bow hunting and conservation, and it's led me to my career where I am. But just passionate about hunting, fishing, diving, the food, and love cooking whatever I catch and making it for my family and trying to, make quality food, and love the adventure of everything. And so it's really great to get to talk about this stuff for work and also live it as much as I can with two small kids. Tougher to get out these days.
Understand. So what led you to, there's a lot of people that hunt and fish. What led you to the conservation route?
So the conservation route, really, I think I was a volunteer for BHA, found out about them while I was working for a division of Mitsubishi. Actually, I was a marketing manager, and Mitsubishi owns like a golf and an archery division of a carbon fiber tube plant. So I was working on the archery side of things, learned about BHA, became a volunteer, kind of dabbled a little bit. And then as soon as I had my daughter, my first kid, something kind of clicked, and I just realized that I have been hunting and fishing for a long time, and really enjoying a lot of the resources, and that I just had this desire to make sure that those were going to be around for my daughter, that we could do that together for a long time. And so just kind of immersed myself a little bit more into giving back and doing some more volunteering and understanding just the connections with my food and where these things were coming from, and the processes that were there to ensure that we have these, conservation designations and good populations of fish and wildlife. But I think it was like just becoming a dad, something flipped in me. It was very strange.
That's very cool. I think that's something a lot of people can relate. You kind of look through it with a different lens, like looking back, you kind of, I don't want to say live vicariously through your kids, but you remember when you were that age and like, wow, everything to come is going to be amazing. And then you start thinking about that. Wait, what's it going to look like in 20 years, 30 years?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So, ab diving up in California, I just have to be honest, and everybody, that just sounds, well, in some regard, very scary. In others regards, it's like, because I've been up there quite a few times. There's days where it's beautiful, I'm sure. But every time I've gone up there to surf or something, it's just like the big, angry Pacific, And, there's big critters, but it's so funny because, like, got no problem paddling out. But when I'm diving, or to dive for, like, lingcod or abalone up there, it's like there's always a little bit higher pulse rate than usual. Yeah.
That's for sure.
But yeah, how did you get into diving up there? Was there something that kind of triggered it, or?
I surfed, got into surfing first, and just, became more comfortable with the water. I've been fishing for a really long time already, since I was, just like a really young kid. And so one of my family friends invited me over and cooked up some abalone for me, barbecued it, and he fried it, and it was just the best thing I've ever tasted. And so I was like, you got to take me, man. You got to teach me how I can find some of this stuff myself. And so Yeah, he made sure to take me on the days, those, more rare Northern California days that were just beautiful, not a lot of surge and clear water, just to kind of make sure that I got a good experience to start. But it's not Southern California diving, that's for sure. It definitely feels different.
Yeah, Dev, everything just seems bigger up. And when you go north in the Pacific, even diving in like Washington, everything's just bigger. Anemones are bigger. Like, I don't know, it's pretty awesome. And I always say, like, you can't fake loving diving up there. You really got to enjoy it. There's no fair weather divers up there, really. I mean,
yeah, you got to have the rubber for it too. Like trying to go without a 7 mil. And I remember the first time I went just with my surf wetsuit, and lasted about 20 minutes.
Yeah, it's funny. It's like the beginner mistake everybody makes, right? Is just saying wetsuit, got it. And it's like, man, I don't understand why I'm freezing here, but I'm surfing, I'm fine. It's like, well, you're not immersed in cold water for, and then you did some backcountry fishing, which I love. I think that's such a cool thing. I mean, California is such an amazing state. And even though like there's a lot of things that people don't like about it, understandably so, but as far as the terrain, this place blows away so many states and the diversity of it all. It's amazing. And it's worth fighting for. And that's kind of why I think what your organization is really centered around preserving, like most conservation efforts, preserving California, correct?
Yeah, I would say conserving California, and there's like just that subtle nuance, but it does play out in different circumstances, right, between the concept of preservation and conservation. And so while the two are essentially talking about the same thing, there's a few like kind of management differences when you really dive into preserving an area, which I would say, like our marine protected areas are preserved because they're very hands-off nose-on approach to how we look at protecting an area. I would say some of the terrestrial conservation designations that we used, for instance, a wilderness area, I would say that's more conserved because it's still hands-on. You're still allowing for hunting, fishing, hands-on restoration, habitat restoration, even though there's more restrictions on motor vehicle use. And, wilderness has its own sort of standards for preserving that wilderness character. And it's certainly not the only designation, but yeah, not to get into the weeds on preserve versus conserve. That's just like a small teaser into where the conversation might go in terms of like how people are arguing and sort of advocating for what we should do with the incredibly rich resources of California. And BHA, we're a 501c3 nonprofit. We've got chapters in 49 states, a couple of Canadian provinces and territories, and our mission's to advocate for wild public lands, waters, and wildlife. So we do that on the state and federal level in Congress for legislation and appropriations, for conservation funding and programs. And then we also do hands-on habitat restoration and stewardship projects throughout the nation and throughout North America. And that's a kind of a big picture look at BHA, which is really just a grassroots organization built from the ground up by volunteers. And that's how we get what we can get done and kind of punch above our weight class.
I love it, man. And please do. Let's dive into the weeds for the novices like myself, like as far as like conservation wise, that term is thrown out so much, and preservation. And it's just funny to see two people that are fighting under the same umbrella half the time. And I guess maybe that is two different umbrellas, preservation and conservation. Could you explain a little bit more about that? And then also one more thing, the wilderness thing. I never really thought about it too much. I just thought the wilderness areas were just awesome for hiking and everything. Could you go into a little bit of the conservation efforts that you guys have done in those areas as well?
Yeah, Yeah, absolutely. So I think to just kind of add another point to preservation versus conservation. So, we work to restore habitats in a number of different areas. So we've worked within wilderness areas, let's say, and so the Southern California desert. We've worked with the Marines actually at Camp Pendleton to fly helicopters deep into wilderness to replace infrastructure that's out there to offset the impacts of drought for bighorn sheep populations. And so they'll actually fly in these tanks that retain water, and there's rain catcher mats, and they fill up, and they basically just provide an alternative water source during the drought, and for several water sources that have been offset from development. And so that's like a project that we do in wilderness that has to get a lot of clearance, because you're not really supposed to have, like motorized vehicles and equipment in wilderness, so that when you or I or anyone does backpacking into the canyons, you can't drive in. Right? So when you're out there, it's wild. There's no motor noise. Hopefully, there's no real mechanical things happening. It's you and nature and the experience, and it's separate from the development and just kind of like the chaos of what is our society. Also, these designations are fantastic because pretty much all of them you can hunt and fish, and so it's a connection to that real, like rugged and amazing tradition and heritage that we have in North America, hunting and fishing. And that's what our organization is all about, continuing that legacy. So, we work for these designations and these conservation designations, whether they be wilderness. Not every place is appropriate for wilderness. Some places, there are different designations that may be appropriate. Sometimes it's a national monument. Sometimes it's entry management area or an area of critical and environmental concern. There's always different types of tools that we can apply and advocate for. But for BHA, we're always cognizant of not losing that access piece for hunting and angling particularly. Whereas, in a national park, if we make it something a national park, you're not going to be able to hunt and fish there. And not to say anything bad about our national parks, which are amazing, but that designation isn't appropriate for a lot of areas that, you would lose that access. And so I think, to go back into the difference with how an area is preserved, on land, we have things called state game refuges that are 100 years old. They were established before we had the Fishing Game Commission and all of our laws that are designed to protect and conserve our wild game populations. And they drew these circles on the map in California and said, this is just an area where there's no hunting. And they've lasted for over 100 years, pretty much. But the Department of Fish and Wildlife has studied them, and their perspective is that they actually they provide no value, because they don't allow the department to actually manage the population how they would like to, through hunting and fishing, or not fishing, but through hunting or just more active management. And so, to me, I see a parallel between these state game refuges that the department would get rid of if they could, I think, but it's a legislative move that would require removal. I see a parallel between those and marine protected areas that are no fishing zones. And so, to back up a little bit, like me personally and BHA as an organization, we're not like opposed to marine protected areas wholesale. I think there's a lot of value that we've seen from MPAs, and I think that there are some examples that are really like things to be excited about as far as what they're contributing. And so you have to look at each one in its location and its regulations and how it's fitting into the bigger picture. So not like anti-MPA, but we are, cognizant of making sure that we're not losing access to establish preservation designations for new MPAs in areas where they have not allowed any type of active restoration, right? So that's really the crux of preserve, is let's just let nature do its thing, and we're gonna put our hands up and say nature's gonna take care of everything. And when you look at some of the MPAs in like central Northern California, they're just urchin barrens because we haven't gone in and done any active restoration. And I think, hopefully we're going to start to pivot there and be a little bit more hands-on and really like work to conserve those areas and not just say, well, nature's going to take care of everything. Because I think we've seen that doesn't always work.
Yeah, those are great talking points too, as far as the MPAs, and how you paralleled them with with the, everything terrestrial there. With the question though, can you give us some more examples of, like you said, Northern California, where the urchins? Why do you think the urchins have just taken over? And like, so if we always think in our minds like, oh, California 200 years ago. California 200 years ago must have been just amazing, right? And maybe it was. I wasn't alive 200 years ago, but maybe it was. But what happened now to where the preservation approach doesn't allow for the same success that California 200 years ago would have had? I know that's tough.
I mean, I think
because I've asked myself the same question. That's why I don't know all the information. So
I think that part of it is time. So I think that if we were to truly remove ourselves from the equation and give it enough time, I think a lot of these processes would ultimately probably play out. Because when you have a species that's just dramatically overpopulated, usually nature will regulate that through disease. So you'll get some sort of disease just going to come in and wipe out that population. And so that's, in the long term, possibly how these things would kind of like be self-regulated without any type of human intervention. I think a couple hundred years ago, though, you just didn't have the same human inputs into the system. And so, I'll preface everything that I say with like, I'm not a, oceanographer or biologist. And so I'm just, someone who likes to hunt and fish, and I do this for my job. But, I try to inform myself with the best available literature and science out there. But, it's not professional opinion on these things. That being said, I think the amount of input that we have into the oceans and what's happening with, oceans getting warmer, with climate change, with all the pollution that we're seeing and we're putting into the system, you're getting you'll see what happened in like 2014, 2016. Maybe that, it's probably a good argument that humans contributed to the warming event. Hard to say, could have just been cyclical, but that resulted in, the sea star wasting disease that wiped out a ton of sea stars that were primary predator of the urchins, and then the urchin population just exploded. And without that natural predator, then you just have this amazing overpopulation. I think there's like some areas it's like 6,000 times how many urchins there really should be. And so, they're going in and they're eating all the kelp. And then you have these issues with abalone, and it's just this, sort of trophic cascade there from that keystone predator species. And so there's probably an argument to be made that we exacerbated ocean warming event through human caused climate change or ocean warming. I won't say it was humans entirely. These things, there's also cycles, but there's some great, evidence to point to that we're adding inputs into the system at this really high level. And so we're having these impacts. And as a result, we need to have more of a hands-on approach to mitigating those impacts to the system. I think the same thing goes for lands and like what we do as far as our restoration projects, right? Like we're a part of the entire system. So in a lot of these places, like for instance, the bighorn sheep guzzlers, like we probably built a McDonald's on a watering hole that bighorn sheep used for thousands of years. And so as a result, we need to offset that impact that humans have on the system by providing an alternative water source. Otherwise, that herd that relies on like, a unique source of water in a super arid region is going to die. I think that's like the parallel on lands that, we're a part of the system. So we need to be a part of the solution also when we're solving these problems.
Yeah, I think that's, I think exactly what you said. I like what you said, because if you think about it too, it's, you know, in the 50s, they hunted so many sheep's head. And so that population is not even nearly probably what it was 50, 70 years ago. And then therefore, just leaving stuff alone, the population wouldn't be able to grow at such a rate to offset the overpopulation now urchins. And then the other thing that the other example that I bring up with the sea lions, because they had the Marine Mammal Protection Act of 1972, which is like basically hands off any marine mammal. Don't even do anything to change their natural behavior. Very loose standards, but they had the domoic acid issue that popped up. And it's like I always say, nature finds a way to balance itself out. So they had the sea lions just showing up. And I asked one of the SeaWorld people, I was like, is this something that occurs naturally in nature? They said, yes. I was like, so why are we interfering with this? We can all agree. And I was a sea lion trainer. So I do have a special place in my heart for these animals, but I'm also aware that they're overpopulated. And I don't think anybody would argue that. And the problem is, here you have nature trying to balance itself out. And then certain organizations, and I know everybody's heart's in the right place, and I think that's what people need to understand too. You know, SeaWorld rescuing these animals, rehabbing them and letting them go. It's like, dude, nature's trying to sort the trash out. And you guys are interfering with that. And then now, as I saw a headline the other day, was that in Northern California or Central California, all the sea lions showing up on the beach. And I didn't read the entire article, because who knows, everything's so headline heavy. And then you look and it was 2 sea lions actually that were starving for a lack of fish. You know, it's like starving because of a lack of fish. It was like, well, what did you expect? Nature will find a way to sort this stuff out. So it has to. Otherwise, you adapt or die. And that's pretty much it. So with the MPAs, because I have gotten, like, my personal belief with the MPAs is like the same thing. They're not particularly bad. I don't really have a problem. What I have a problem with is the criteria to either shut them down or open them up. And then what is the plan to reopen areas? Why couldn't we just rotate certain areas, either biannual, like cyclical, like say every 2 years, or, what is the criteria for reopening it back up? And from what I've seen personally is they just shut it down. They don't open it back up. And then the other thing is you can never open it back up at this point, especially the ones that I've been in, because the fish just swim right up to you and they would be massacred in a matter of days if you open back up, as far as with people wanting to shoot a 10-pound calico or 8-pound calico. And
no pressure.
What have you looked into a little bit of the data as far as like the idea of an MPA is to like set up like a closure to help that place kind of rehab and come back and thrive, and then seed other areas around there, is correct?
Yeah, that's like the source and sink kind of concept of spillover.
Right. And from my understanding, and like you had said too, like I'm not a biologist or anything, but that hasn't really been proven to be as strongly impactful as they had thought. Would you agree with that, or do you know?
So like, there's a lot of people that are arguing that as like a principal, reason why we have MPAs. From what I've seen, there's a study that's frequently referenced, which is a commercial lobster study in Santa Barbara, where lobster catch increased from people fishing the line of an MPA, and that is commonly used to justify the concept of spillover. There's another study of longline tuna fishermen in Hawaii that's often cited, and those are the 2 that I'm really aware of. There's a few other studies out there that argue that spillover is not a universal result of an MPA. It has a lot to do with sighting, and it has a lot to do with habitats inside and outside of MPAs, right? Like if you've got an MPA here and you drew it around a rocky reef, and adjacent to it is a, sandy, fish is not going over there unless there's a similar habitat type as well. So I think like that piece of the puzzle is important. The part that's really hard to understand is like the larval drift and transport, right, that you've got going on. And I think that's what MPA managers are hoping, is that you have like the connectivity between these MPAs, so you'll get this like larval transport, and these MPAs are going to be these source populations that will then go and like replenish the ocean in other areas. It's just not very well, I think, documented as far as the spillover principle is concerned. I'm not going to say that it's not happening, but I think they just need a lot more research, especially as it comes to like recreational fishing. What's the impact on the recreational fishermen between these MPAs? Because to your point, like there aren't any plans to open up MPAs, and when MPA managers and the commission and the Ocean Protection Council and everybody talks about these, they say repeatedly, like, don't weaken the network, which is an interesting use of words, because it's like, don't change it at all. Like, don't open up any restrictions, don't do any boundary changes, don't take any MPAs away. That would weaken it. And, we just reached the decadal management review of the network, where we're evaluating how it worked for the last 10 years and coming up with adaptive management recommendations. And, that cycle was there's just, I think, some opportunities there to look at limited take MPAs in particular and how they're being effective in achieving the goals of the Marine Life Protection Act compared to no take MPAs, right? Because we've got some MPAs that you can pretty much still harvest anything you want. They allow for commercial and recreational fishing and pretty much all the gear types. And then there's some that allow for zero take, and there's some that are somewhere in between. And so, in my opinion, we need to be studying these limited take MPAs to understand how effective they are in comparison to the no takes, to try to look at more targeted restrictions.
Okay. Yeah, and I think that the idea is everybody is kind of behind like a better environment, but there's just not a ton of research to back up, honestly, either side. Like I said before, like for my understanding is, of course, fishing the edge kind of benefits you, but what about 100 meters from the edge, and exactly what you said, what's on the other side. I know that from diving, when you swim through La Jolla Cove and you go up over by Boomer's Beach in La Jolla, there is a line, and we always joke around about it, like how the fish just know exactly where to stay, which would say, as far as like for the adult size fish, the spillover really isn't happening. But one thing I'd say about California, which I think you don't really appreciate it until you travel different places. I mean, besides Baja or something, that our fishery, for the amount of people in the water, the amount of people just in general, even on land, and the amount of people fishing, our fishery is pretty fucking kick-ass, because we have a great, healthy fishing, like the size of the fish. I mean, every year our white sea bass are getting bigger and bigger, it seems. Even this year, even in La Jolla, or even in yellowtail, somebody shot a 50-pound yellowtail, and I know somebody shot a 60-pounder years ago, but as a whole, it just feels like, dude, our fishery's doing well. And so maybe like the environmentalist groups that want to shut things down are saying, yes, we got to keep shutting things down because it's improving. Where the conservation side, the sportsmen, if you will, are like, no, see, everything's getting great. Like, so what we're doing, if we just like is actually working, we're managing rather than just, like you said, preserving. Yeah, it's wild, because I really do think things have gotten better. When they stopped the gill nets I mean, netting is terrible, and we did it. They did a good job here, and they stopped that. And it does seem like, man, the fish populations are really coming back, especially the white sea bass. And they are being proactive at the hatcheries and all of that. But I just don't understand right now. We'll get into a little bit of this, like the 30 for 30, but also the organization that is trying to save the kelp by, to me, that's the excuse, trying to save the kelp by shutting down the kelp beds. And I don't think that's the best way to save the kelp. I think the best way personally is to, well, stop shooting sheep's head if you want. They eat the urchins won't eat the kelp. You know, that I know from my own backyard, I'm speaking, like in La Jolla, Point Loma.
Right.
I think that would make the biggest impact, not shutting it down.
Yeah, and that's the kind of targeted restriction, right? Like that I think the fishing community would get behind too. Not, I'm not like necessarily advocating for this thing in particular. I think getting the science behind it to look at it from the department perspective. All of the petitions that are currently before the commission are a zero sum, just let's turn everything into a state marine reserve and eliminate all fishing access to solve one particular problem. And I just don't think that solution makes sense. I don't think the, prescription there is really, it fits what we're trying to solve. And so, we need to recognize that humans have been a part of this system for a very long time. And just removing ourselves from the equation, like we have been fishing in the ocean for a very long time. And I think it's important to recognize that, because people often, don't assume that we're part of nature and this natural process, but we are. And so, I think when we're moving forward as a fishing community, I think the fishing community has been pretty willing to support, slot limits or bag limits or size restrictions or what have you to support the fishery. And that's why we have the Pacific Fisheries Management Council. We have the Department of Fish and Wildlife and the Fish and Game Commission and the Magnuson-Stevenson's Fishery Conservation and Management Act. Like, we have all these regulations and laws designed to support and manage our fisheries. And a lot of the MPA science that is used to advocate for more no-take closures are MPAs that are in other countries or regions around the world that don't have those same fisheries management laws and regulations. And so I think it's not an apples to apples comparison to say that an MPA here and the results are the same as an MPA in California coastal waters, and that the science that we're using to evaluate these petitions needs to be local science, so that we're comparing that within the framework and structure of our existing laws and fisheries management.
I'm glad you said that, because when you think about it, I mean, every fish species is so unique. Every ecosystem, you can't on one hand talk about how delicate and specific California's ecosystem is, and then on the other hand, use something completely different as an argument to shut it all down. Like, that just doesn't make sense to me. But how is BAA, like, how are you guys, BHA, excuse me, how are you guys, like, how are you fighting this? So let's say you say volunteers were doing restoration. Are you working with like a local official, like a congressman? Are you how are you being proactive on to educating or at least discussing this issue?
So what we're doing right now is we've got a pretty detailed comment letter that we've put together, and we've worked with a lot of different fishing groups and dive clubs, but also just organizations that are dedicated to conservation and fishing, to sign that letter that details our perspective on the numerous petitions before the Fish and Game Commission. And we provide our recommendations. We've been sending in comment letters for years on the place to 30 by 30 document, the decadal management review, the different processes here that have been sort of circling around this moment that we're in right now of potential large scale closures of fishing areas to new MPAs. And so we've been engaged in the process for many years, but we're also just encouraging anglers and spearos and everyone to show up at these commission meetings to provide comment in a respectful way, and also to sign our counter petition that advocates for these, targeted management and science-based management of fisheries where, if there isn't a clear argument to shut down a fishery, and if there's not clear science that says we should close this area, we don't want to have that preservationist principle just take over and say, well, there's a possibility that closing this could have a positive effect, but we don't really have that clearly documented. So let's just eliminate access to fishing here that's existed for a very, very, very long time.
Yeah. And, also like something to consider that I don't really hear much of talk about is just the growth rate of certain fish. And like, say, if you are going to shut something down, well, what's the growth rate of the fish in that area that you are planning on shutting down to reach sexual maturity? And then it seems like there's a very easy way to shut something down and have it be effective rather than just go shut it down and never open it back up. And it's very like measurable. Like you'd have to be in the water and take samples and samples and samples. Like what you're saying. Yeah. And I just want to throw one more thing out here because it's just it's frustrating because I don't know a lot of the research that they're referring to, but I heard something like, and someone say, oh, they're taking pictures of kelp and comparing it over the years. As far as the expanding the MPAs to a lot of these kelp beds. And one thing about that, it's like, well, what's the current that day? Like, what's the tidal change? What was the wind? Because every day you go to the kelp bed, a lot of kelp's just right under the surface. Was it after a significant swell event where it just ripped up a lot of the kelp? So to make those claims, like you'd have to provide a lot of data. And I want everybody to understand, like, rather than taking something as face value. And if it is, then it is. Then that's fine. I understand, like, if it's like, okay, these are legit, same current, same time, that's fine. But don't just take things as face value because everybody has an agenda, including us. Like we want to have a healthy ecosystem so we could go shoot big fish or catch big fish, shoot big animals, whatever it is. Absolutely. So everybody has an agenda. So you just have to like look at what that agenda is. But with you guys, you talked about signing the forms to fight these things. Where, do you just go to your website? Do you have a website, or where could just commoners, if you will, us normal little people, go to like a rally point?
Yeah. So if you go to backcountryhunters.org and you go to the Take Action, Get Involved tab, you'll see a whole bunch of things happening all across North America, but it can filter by California. That'll be sampled for what's happening in state. And, I think it's really important for people to understand just like the timeline too, because these petitions, they really won't have any action until much later in the year and probably moving for multiple years, because a lot of them I would say are probably a distraction and a little bit frustrating for the Fish and Game Commission because they're detracting from the work that they want to do, and it's requiring the Department of Fish and Wildlife to provide these reports and recommendations on petitions that, some of them I just think they really have no business. They're not a good application of science. So it's not that they're using bad science to justify a closure, it's that they're misapplying science to advocate for a particular closure. And I think one particular example is the proposed MPA in Carpinteria, which says there's a juvenile great white shark breeding ground here, so we need to protect this area because the number one cause of mortality for juvenile great white sharks is fishing. Okay, when they cite the paper, so you look at the paper, and the paper is primarily focusing on gillnet fisheries in Baja. And so there's not really a whole lot of data at all showing that fisheries in the United States are killing juvenile great white sharks. There's very limited amount, and all of those mortalities are from gill nets primarily. And so establishing an MPA in this area where it's a no-take reserve, so you can't lobster dive, you can't spearfish, you can't shorefish, any of these things, like none of these are having any impact on juvenile great white sharks. But that's the argument that's being made to close off this entire area. It's like, guys, this argument obviously just doesn't hold water, and it's misapplied science.
Who is making that argument too? What was the organization? Do you know?
That's the Natural Resources Defense Council. They've got a couple petitions that were, pretty opposed to. There's a few other petitions that, I would say are a little bit more nuanced that would be good to get the department's perspective on. I don't think that the State Marine Reserve is appropriate, but I do think that there's, potentially some targeted restrictions that could come about. And, maybe the department says, yeah, we need to stop hunting sheep's head in this particular area because we do want them to go in and eat the urchins. And that's a beneficial, system. And we want to prop up that population as much as possible. If the department says that, then I think the fishing community would rally behind that and say, okay, let's not shoot sheep's heads here. And instead, we'll shoot everything else. But, I don't think the fishing community is going to say because one species is being fished that we don't want to, that let's stop fishing entirely, because there's just not a good link there, I think. And that there's a better way to go about that.
Yeah, and one little point about sheep's head, they only eat urchins when they get to a certain size. They kind of switch over to urchins and crustaceans after a certain size. So I would say, like, if you pull the trigger on a big one, that might be the one that's actually doing the most good in the reef. So maybe a medium-sized one. I mean, we talked about slots limits before a lot on the show. Slot limits and that seems to be really impactful and do a lot of good things in a lot of places. And I wonder if it would have the same impact here, potentially. I mean, it makes common sense. It passes the common sense test, that's for sure. But again, I think the important thing everybody needs to know is that even though we're fishermen and we take, like, we're not saying don't manage it. Just doesn't make any sense to shut everything down in a preserve environment. But I actually thought about contacting some of these groups and seeing about getting someone on the show and hearing their side, and everything's respectful, and maybe even bringing somebody like you on, or somebody from, backcountry, and have them like discuss it. But I'm afraid, I thought about this quite a bit, is that rather than, you mentioned, some of the, like, right, the statistics that they pull out, some of them are like just cherry picked and not exactly accurate. And some of them are, then they're great. But I'd want to read up on the research and really ask the right questions so that when everybody came on, you were well versed in it, so that you can ask the right questions, and I'll make sure to kind of do your quality control check. I think that would be cool. Just,
I think so too. And I think it'd be cool to do in this type of forum. I also am excited for the Marine Resources Committee meetings that are coming up, because they've indicated a desire to look at some of these petitions and use the MRC as a forum for these stakeholder groups to discuss details here. And I think that it's a good opportunity to, maybe even discuss and have some, disagreement, but also figure out where the common area is and where we overlap. Because, like you said, we all have the same objective, right? We want a healthy, ocean with abundant fish populations. And I think there's probably more than one way to get there. And so understanding where the overlaps are and how, as a community, we may not agree on everything. There's probably things that we agree on, and using that opportunity to identify those things just in a good old-fashioned conversation. Because to me, the one thing that is just really absent from all of the organizations that are petitioning commission and working on 30 by 30, which is, the 30% conservation of lands and waters by 2030, like, the piece that's absent from that puzzle on the ocean side is that nobody's talking about water pollution. And, like the last like decade, I think there's been a couple 100 million gallons of raw sewage dumped in the ocean up and down the coast. And, and it happens all the time. It just, this year there was 500,000 gallons, I think it was, in Santa Barbara that got dumped in Goleta, and that's going straight into a marine protected area. And there's no water quality protection for an MPA. So like there are areas of special biological significance that provide water quality protections, but those are few and far between. And most of the MPAs do not have any water quality protection whatsoever. But nobody is talking about this or advocating for this. And it's crazy to me.
I am so glad you brought that up, because anybody that lives in San Diego knows the giant sewage spill that happens every time it rains. And when you fly out of San Diego, if you look to the left, and I know because I dove in these waters every day for work, 5 days a week, there's a giant poo smear, it looks like, coming from the sloughs, Tijuana sloughs, all the way up to the jetty, to Zanaga Jetty. And it's just like straight pollution all the time. Whenever it rains, and I'm not blaming Mexico for this, because Mexico needs probably some help and resources too, but it's like, we need to do a better job, because even in Ocean Beach, when I go surfing, it's just, there's a constant sign there that says, warning, water level exceeds bacterial limits. And it's like, here we are doing all these things in all these other areas, and I can't even go in the fucking water because it's so dirty. That's embarrassing. And nobody, like you said, nobody's even talking about it. Like, I've had 2 staph infections from surfing the jetty there. I've had chronic ear infections, and I know it's related to the water exclusively, because I go to places like Guam for 6 months, surf every day without earplugs, don't even rinse out with 50% vinegar, 50% alcohol, in the water every day. Not one ear infection. I came home, forgot to wear earplugs one day, surfed twice that week, ear infection in 2 weeks. And it just shows you the level of bacteria and pollution in that water. And it doesn't, and so it just actually really does actually get me fired up and disgusting, because it's like, it disgusts me, because we're looking at one hand, we're not seeing what the other hand is doing. And that's the easiest thing to address. Well, it's the thing that probably needs to be addressed the most.
Yeah.
And how do you address it? I don't know, but it needs to be addressed.
Well, and first of all, I literally just finished a course of like ear antibiotic drops for an ear infection. So I feel it on that one, man.
Yeah.
And, I think that there are mechanisms to address it, right? Like, we have these laws and designations of these areas of special biological significance are designed to protect water quality and limit pollution and sewage outputs. And the Tijuana River is a tricky one, because you've got this like cross-border issue. But so, that one requires its own set of solutions. But when you look at what's happening up and down our coast, like we're dumping sewage in the water, even in San Diego. If you look at the number of sewage spills, it is just mind-blowing how much sewage we dump into the ocean. And they're mostly preventable infrastructure failures. They're mostly like a lack of routine maintenance. They didn't clean out like the grease trap. They have, just aging infrastructure. And these are things where it's like, we have to do better to protect our resources and our people that are going in the ocean. And I think that, there are some pretty valid theories in my mind of the reason why kelp is struggling in a lot of these areas is because the water quality is so bad from all the neutral and algal blooms that are coming out there, that you're just not getting the same type of light penetration to the depth that these new kelp stalks will need to actually be able to grow. There's probably not one factor that's limiting kelp, but that's certainly a valid one. If we're dumping a bunch of sewage and pollution in the ocean and the water's so dirty that the light actually can't penetrate to the bottom, it's a pretty valid theory in my mind that it should be explored. And regardless of anything, like, we should be limiting raw sewage going into the ocean just for health
Yeah, that's an excellent point. Yeah, I mean, there's probably a reason why you haven't seen too many white sea bass coming out of San Diego, South San Diego lately, because the visibility is just fucking garbage the last month. But yeah, some of that's red tide, but most of it's red tide. But yeah, that stuff plays a massive role in this whole key. I mean, that's the bottom of the food chain, and everything is built off of that. And so, man, I just feel like we could just all come together, unless there's an ulterior motive, right? If it's money, then that's different. I'm assuming everything has a little bit of money component to it, but there's no reason why we couldn't all come together and come up with a greater good for kelp in this situation. You talked about the 30 for 30, and it's 30, and correct me if I'm wrong, 30% of the marine area protected by 2030.
Yep.
So someone that may not really understand that, well, what's wrong with that? Could you answer that question for them, or go into the details of it?
Yeah, I'd say there's nothing wrong with it, right? So it's 30%, conserving 30% of lands and waters by 2030. Like, on everybody, I think, that hunts and fishes or loves nature or exists on this planet should feel like this is probably a good thing to do. The where we disagree is on what are the mechanisms that we're trying to do to achieve that, and what counts as protected or conserved. And so right now, the state says that 16% of our coastal waters are conserved because those are the number of MPAs they have. So the only things that count for 30 by 30 are MPAs right now. National marine sanctuaries include a lot more than 30%. When I would say MPAs, it's like 40-some% of our coastal waters would be conserved. And the Biden administration, who also has, put forth their America the Beautiful and 30 by 30 initiative, they say national marine sanctuaries do count. A Newsom administration says they don't, and that they're not a durable enough protection. And so right now, the Ocean Protection Council is trying to define what actually counts. And this summer, they're going to have a series of regional workshops where they're putting forth like this discussion of what actually should count. And they just released a draft framework yesterday for what they say counts. And they don't say national marine sanctuaries count. They also don't say areas of special biological significance count, and the number of other single spiritual conservation along the coast. And so for us as a community, for me, for BHA, for I would say like the majority of the fishing community, we want these conservation designations, right? Like, we don't want our coastal fisheries and resources to be subject to a bunch of destructive industry or massive sewage pollution or any of the things that could, reduce or eliminate our hunting, fishing. So we want that conserved so we can continue to hunt and fish. But the question is, how do we do it? And most of the groups that are working on 30 by 30 are saying the only way to accomplish this is through 30% no-take marine protected areas. So 30% state marine reserves or state marine conservation areas that do not allow for any take whatsoever. And that's where we disagree, because we think that there's a lot more nuance. It should be evaluating conserved areas, and then also what the value is of no-take reserve versus limited take reserve, and all the other opportunities that there are to conserve local waters. In my opinion, if you have an MPA that has sewage pouring into it constantly, like, is it really conserved? I don't know. I would argue that that's not really something that sounds like it's well protected in my mind, and that we should probably be doing something about the water quality issue first and foremost before we're talking about regulating fishing, or at least hand in hand.
Yeah, well, I think it's too easy, and it's probably a lot cheaper to say, hey, recreational people, you're done. For legislators and all of that, it's very easy just to stop us rather than having to say, hey, we have to spend millions, maybe billions, in resetting standards, updating infrastructure. But I think, and that's going to cause money, and but the good thing is it's going to create jobs. But I agree with what you said. I think the thing with the 30 for 30 is that I think they need to start with the question of what is our goal here? Is it to preserve? Is it to strengthen? Is it to grow certain species at certain sizes? Like, what is the goal? Because if it's to preserve, that means there's not a whole lot of debate there. If it's to preserve, and preserve means do not, no human interaction, then I would do we have, it just seems like to me that if we tried something like that, are they trying anything like that? We're talking about specifically marine, but are they trying things like that on the terrestrial side as well, like in the forest? I mean, we have the wilderness areas which allow us to take, but the national parks, like you said, that's a preserve. Are they trying to increase the preservation on the terrestrial side as well?
Some, I would say, like smaller scale efforts to do that, but the vast majority of the sort of conservation designations that have been proposed are not going to restrict hunting access. And it's hard. It's different on land because you've got, commercial hunting was outlawed over 100 years ago. And so the commercial side of the fishing industry is, I think, where it gets a little bit trickier when we're talking about marine issues, but it's definitely very different how we look at conservation on land versus in the ocean. I do think it's important to draw those parallels because, we have a ton of examples on land where we go for animal fishing, and we have these very durable, very high level protections. And, a lot of it just comes down to like how we're discussing this in the ocean and the language that's being used from all of the NGOs, from state agencies, from government is like, we have to fully and fully protect. And the only way to do it was through to just disagree with the language there. I think that there's an opportunity for us to say, hey, look, we have these areas that are very well protected from water quality perspective, from industry, extractive industry perspective, but we also allow people to go in there and fish according to, the restrictions that we have in place from, the department and NOAA and all the rest. So this is what we want to put forward in this process for 30 by 30 as a gold standard. And the state itself and the Pathways to 30 by 30 document writes that state marine conservation areas that allow for commercial and recreational fishing are an excellent model for 30 by 30. So there's just some interesting, I would say, inconsistencies with the approach and the language that's being used. And I think that ultimately there's probably some big money and there's some big influence that is advocating for this, restriction on access. And I don't want to go deep state or anything like that, but there are groups that have an agenda that is not pro hunting and fishing. And that's the reality of where we are. And, as much as possible, I think as a community, we just need to be like pounding the drum of science-based management and good locally applied science to guide our management decisions. And we live in sword, right?
Yeah. And I'll say this, the only thing I'll say about this is that you're going after recreational fishing, which is such a drop in the bucket compared to commercial fishing. The difference is commercial fishing is a lot of money and have power, and you can't just take someone's livelihood away and say, okay, cool, don't commercial fish, you're done, your jobs are done, right? That's not fair either. But I do know when I'm running around all summer long trying to shoot, 2-3 tuna, and then some airplane and a tuna boat rolls up and scoops up a mile of tuna, I do know that maybe my limiting me to 2 fish a day probably isn't the most impactful on the environment when I just saw a mile of tuna school just get completely decimated and killed the entire zone for like 3 days or a week because everything in that zone is spooked. So it's like, again, they're going after, like, I agree with you. It's like, if I apply these, I look at it like, man, maybe we could draw an analogy. If you could apply what they're trying to do for 30 for 30 and look at it on land and say, listen, if we made these areas preserves, 30% of the Sierra Nevada range preserve, and then we just had acid rain and just dumped nuclear waste all through there, is that preserved? Because that's literally what's going on.
Exactly.
So it's like, that's just common sense, you know, and then say, oh, we're helping. Like, come on, man. Like, and stop you guys from hunting. Okay. But meanwhile, everyone's using it as their toxic waste dump. You know, another example of that is like the San Onofre power plant. It's like, you know, nuclear energy, great, but you got to maintain it. And when they didn't maintain it, it leaked. I mean, God knows what the damage with that was to the environment. There's a kelp bed right out there.
Yeah.
You know, and there's a kelp bed to the south of it, which, by the way, the current usually runs south. Yeah. And so, yeah, I agree with you. And that's a really good point. The water thing needs to be addressed. And I think first and foremost, if they really want, and I think that's something that the environmentalists, I think sports, we could all get behind and hopefully have a common ground. Yeah. Man, and I am so glad that you came on to talk about this, just because this conversation needs to happen. And I think moving forward for all of us in this region and all of this in this area, not just spear fishermen talking to a spear fisherman or diver or whatever, fisherman talking to fishermen, we need to talk to the environmental groups. And I do feel that if their heart is in the right place and we act all like adults, we could come up with a good solution. I just don't see how we couldn't come to an agreement unless there is some ulterior motive. You know, like you said, not to get all conspiracy theorists, but some's got to be funding all this stuff, you know, and some people have full-time jobs just for creating problems. Like full-time jobs, meaning like if there's no problem, then there's no job. Like people talk back about the war on drugs. We get into the war on drugs, but you know how many jobs the war on drugs has created? Like how much funding is created, right? But I don't think fishing's like that though. I think there's room for everybody.
Yeah.
Like I said, go ahead.
I was at that MRC meeting. Sorry to jump in on you, but when I was at the MRC meeting, like I introduced myself to one of the guys from the Natural Resources Defense Council who's putting forth these petitions that I just strongly disagree with. And he was excited to learn how to spearfish. And it kind of blew my mind a little bit because I was like, do you realize what you're saying? And like, and I told him, I was like, well, you know, here's my card. Like, you want to learn how to spearfish? I'll take you out spearfishing. Like, because I think ultimately at the end of the day, like what we need to do, and I use this term and I've borrowed this term from a friend who has a kind of podcast and business called Harvesting Nature, but it's venison diplomacy. It's we're going out there and, you know, whether it's hunting or fishing, like you shoot something and you invite people over and you share a meal with them and you talk about why the resource is important to you and what you're going to want to conserve it. Also why we need to maintain access, because I think for a lot of these people, you know, they don't really have that connection, right? And it's like, let's establish these MPAs and then let's go out to sushi and celebrate. And, you know, it's just not a connection to the resource that we have. And I think that's really important to continue to advocate for and to be showing people like where your food actually comes from.
That's beautiful because it's probably so accurate. Except, you know, my goal this year is to convert people from being vegans to spear fishermen or at least fishing or something, because I have talked to a couple of vegans and it's amazing when you just have a conversation and they're like, I'm against huge farming. I'm like, me too. You know, like caged animals, me too. I'm against this or that. I'm like, yeah, I agree. well, how can you shoot an animal? I can shoot it because it's probably the best death that animal's ever going to have. And I know that that animal's died with, and I respect it rather than maybe in a kill house where it's treated like, you know, a piece of meat.
Yeah. We had a couple of vegans at an event we did last year. It's called our Beer Band's Bitterbrush Stands, the big winter range habitat restoration project. And we had like some live bands and things to get people out there to help us with the planting. And one of our board members on the way up happened to shoot a bear, and he brought the back straps and cooked them up for a bunch of people. And we had some vegans who were there who ate it and really enjoyed it. And they were like, oh yeah, well, I'm not really against this, you know, like this is okay. It was like a wild free roaming bear. Like, okay, I'll eat that. Right. And so I just it blew my mind a little bit, but I think just like having those conversations and, you know, inviting people to the table is super important.
Yeah, I agree with you, man. It's funny. It's when you kind of paint, you know, everybody has their idea in their mind of what a hunter is, you know, and they might have like, especially people that never been around it. Maybe they lived in the city their whole life and they think of some big like redneck dude or some fisherman that's just like slamming beers, just killing fish and stickers on the truck, fear no fish and all this stuff.
Yeah.
And it's really like, no, that's not, especially with spearfishermen. It's like, do you know how many hours we spend in the water? Just like, you cannot not feel connected to the environment when half the time you swim. And if you're selective, most of the time you come back empty. Like you said, where you grew up diving, you can't fake loving that. Like there is a connection there. Yeah. So how can people just get more involved? Is it just through the website, or you said you're looking for volunteers?
Yeah. So that's a great question. So the California chapter, there's a couple ways to get involved. If you're interested, you can just shoot an email. So California@backcountryhunters.org, and we'll get you kind of plugged into the board. It's all a volunteer board. There's one paid staff from the state who was formerly the California chapter coordinator before my current position, do a little bit more like across the West. Joel's the California coordinator. You can help get you plugged in. And the other way is, you know, we have an base camp that we organize people and work on policy or events, but we've got an event coming up in San Diego that's an attention cook competition. So, you know, a bunch of people go out, spearfish, shortfish, codfish, whatever you want to do, have something in the morning, and then come cook it before a panel of judges, you know, a bunch of prizes. And the whole goal is to highlight ocean conservation issues. So we did this in Monterey, where we had people winning prizes for going out and collecting urchins. We had prizes for a beach cleanup, and then we had prizes for the actual like competition. We were going to have this on June 22nd, but we just kicked it back. So we're just repositioning a little bit for San Diego on the date and venue, because we were going to have an apartment complex, and I got a 60-day notice to leave because they're turning it into an Airbnb. So I love that. But it's coming. Yeah. It's coming. I've been living 11 years, block and a half from Windansea in this huge yard. I mean, we left out. We've been paying dirt cheap rent, so it's, you know, the writing's been on the wall. But stay tuned on that one. There'll be some, you know, if you follow Backcountry Hunters on Instagram, it's California_BHA, or Backcountry Hunters is the other handle. And you just like follow the social accounts and, you know, get on the newsletter, sign up for the newsletter. And there's going to be a bunch of stuff coming this summer, opportunities to engage in the OPC selection process and criteria for 30 by 30, and as well as the Fish and Game Commission, these Marine Resource Committee meetings, where we just need people to show up, but we need them to be respectful too, right? At the end of the day, most of the time, the anti-hunters are oftentimes like a little come off worse, like especially with the bear issues we've had. They were just super disrespectful, and we really worked hard with the hunting community to just try to keep things very above belt. And I think it's really important, right, that we show up, we're just advocating for science, and we're doing it in a respectful way, and we're showing that the community really cares about these resources, but that there's room for overlap and kind of coming together with some of the other groups out there.
That's great. I just want to say the message is like, guys, we will win if we just be cool. It's like, you win the argument. Just be cool. Why? Because we have facts. We have facts, but we also have like common sense. And then, you know, we do have good leverage. We have good points. And if we just shut up and say it in a nice way, they're going to have to address them. Rather than if we just, like, I listened during COVID, I listened to one of them, and guys were just acting like, you know, literally like fucking children, and it was embarrassing. It was a call-in one or whatever. And you're like, dude, we're losing. You're painting the image that every one of these people have of us. Yeah. It's like, that's the guy. I'm like, cool, great. So no, that's great. I cannot thank you enough for what you're doing, fighting the good fight. And, like I said, I definitely want to stay in touch and try to be a little more involved and more of a voice for organizations like you, your organization, right? Backcountry Hunter and Anglers, to like use as a platform. And I really appreciate what you're doing and keeping the fight for all of us. And hopefully some of us can join the fight. And hopefully some of us, we can convert some of the guys that, you know, maybe change an image that we are just all in this for the good of the environment, and keep California awesome, so that our kids can, you know, go from holding onto our necks while we're snorkeling to right next to us diving and shooting some nice fish. So that's the goal.
Man. That's the dream right there. And I can play us out with a really funny from just a month ago. So I got a call from a guy, just a cold call from Greenpeace, asking for a donation to support oceans. So, okay, well, what are you guys doing? And he said, well, we need to protect 30% of lands and water. So we need to establish 30% no-take MPAs. Or he just said 30% representation. I said, well, hey, appreciate you calling and your concern here, but, you know, as a fisherman, I don't really support 30% no-take MPAs. I think there's other ways we can solve some of these issues. And, you know, I think that closing off an additional 14% of coastal access to fishing without scientific justification is not something I support. And he was like, well, MPAs, they don't remove fishing access entirely. I was like, oh, they do, man. I'm like, yeah, that's what it is. Like, State Marine Reserve, no take. And he's like, well, I'm a fisherman. Like, I don't support that. and we had a conversation for a while. He's like, well, fuck that, man. And pardon my French. Like, and he's just like, you know, like, but like, I don't want to do this. Like, wait a second. Like, I didn't know that. And I'm like, you're calling me about this. Like, we didn't want that. But it was so funny, because I was like, this is such a perfect example, because a lot of people that comment on these meetings, they're, you know, what we have to remember as a community is like, their heart is in the right place. They want to see ocean conservation. 100%. And I truly believe that they think this is the way to do it. And they don't necessarily understand what the ramifications would be for all the different communities up and down the coast, like very diverse communities that all utilize this resource. And so that's where the conversation comes in of like, hey, let me show you what this actually means. And let's look at an alternative thing like these ASBS water quality. It's like, let's all run behind this and get something done.
No, that's a beautiful story. And I think that's perfect exit as far as like, we're all trying. I think the majority of people really do love the environment or trying to do the right thing by it. Some of us aren't exactly sure what it is going on. Some of us are a little more entitled or a little more enlightened, but in the end, if we can just keep our eye on the prize and talk, we can maybe hopefully come up with a win-win solution for everybody. That's the goal, right? Like compromise.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Devin, again for coming on the show. You've been an asset to us in the community just by coming on and sharing what you're trying to do. So I do appreciate that.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. It's been great. And let's find a time to get out there and fish this year.